apex and they're looking out at that marvelous seascape, they decide they want to take a picture. Well, the guy on the left, excuse me, on the right, who was at the time driving a vehicle going across the Bay Bridge, had in the passenger seat his wife. And Ismail El-Barassa and his wife were taking photographs all right, but an alert Maryland Transportation Authority police officer observed that they were not taking pictures of the scenery, they were taking pictures of the structural supports of the bridge. And the police officer thought wisely that that didn't look right, so he pulled them over and ran their IDs and established that El-Barassa was wanted on a material witness arrest warrant out of Chicago for fundraising for a terrorist organization I've mentioned that's much in the news at the moment, Hamas. And that proved to be, as I say, a very providential discovery. The FBI was able to obtain and execute a search warrant on the El-Barassa home in a suburb of Washington, D.C., again not far from where I am, called Annandale, Virginia. And they went top to bottom, and below the bottom, they discovered a secret subbasement in which they found 80 banker boxes worth of documents that constituted the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. One of the documents that was found, next slide, is the one that we've republished, and again, I think we may have some copies, I hope we do, this for you there. It's called an explanatory memorandum on the general strategic goal of the group in North America. And it was published in 1991, not for our consumption. It was produced for the mothership back in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood's home headquarters. And it was basically a report on how things were going in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood's objectives and operations in the United States. If I could go to the next slide. This is the mission statement that's kind of at the core of what amounts to the strategic plan that's laid out in this explanatory memorandum. And it reads, as you can see there on the screen, it's a civilization jihadist process. That's a key word, civilization jihad, whose objective is eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, for the purpose of achieving, with the help of their hands, meaning ours, and the hands of the believers, this goal and the triumph of God's religion, namely Islam, over all other religions. I don't know about you, but that doesn't strike me as all that friendly. In fact, evidence of a pretty ominous purpose, and sets the stage for what I'm going to show you in the next few slides. Before I turn to that, let me just say there was one other helpful feature of this memorandum. The whole thing was very instructive, actually. It really is a kind of playbook for how these guys are trying to operate in our country, and have since 1963. There was at the back end of it an attachment under the heading, Our Organizations and Organizations of Our Friends. You had this, I hope you turn to the next slide, you had this list of 29 organizations. Now this is again 1991, so it was many years ago. And the number of groups that would be on this list today is several times, probably an order of magnitude more than this. But even today, these groups remain among the most prominent Muslim American organizations in the United States. Now, note, I said Muslim American organizations. They're Muslim Brotherhood front groups, to be sure. But when people say whether it's the President of the United States or State Department, Defense Department, other leaders of our government, that they're talking to or reaching out to leaders of the Muslim American community. Typically, they're talking about people who are associated with one or more of these groups, all of which are by the Muslim Brotherhood's own strategic plan, identified as our organizations and organizations of our friends. Next slide. What is civilization jihad? Well, I think you can describe it as a full frontal assault on every civil society and governing institution in the United States. As I say, it started in 1963 when the Muslim Students Association, the second on that list, was founded. It now has some 500 chapters on American campuses. And as you see there on the fourth bullet, one of the things that they're very big on, these Muslim Brotherhood civilization jihadists, is using our educational institutions to advance their agenda. Recruiting, proselytizing, indoctrinating, training, some call it radicalizing, whatever term you wish to use, but it's the process of incubating new recruits for the Muslim Brotherhood. It's being done on a lot of campuses across this country. You'll see as well some of the other hallmarks of this. Interfaith dialogue. We were all in church there, and many churches, I'm sure not the one you're in, but many churches around the United States, many synagogues and other faith communities have been induced over the years to engage in what's been called alternately interfaith dialogue and bridge building between faith communities, the basic purpose of which is to help shield the Muslim Brotherhood and its operations in this country from assault by law enforcement, by professing and having other, clerics attest to the fact that these are people of faith. It goes back to that central message that I wanted to leave with you. If this is about faith, and you have rabbis and you have priests and you have pastors and others attesting to this as being about faith, well, you give people who are actually engaged in sedition a great deal of running room to pursue their objectives. So interfaith dialogue, I think, is one of the most insidious of these civilization jihadist techniques. And I just make one further slight digression. It's important for you to understand. One of the preeminent Muslim Brotherhood ideologues of all time is a fellow by the name of Sayyid Qutb. And Sayyid Qutb wrote a very influential book called Milestones that had, among other passages, a reference to this business of bridge building and interfaith dialogue. And this is a rough paraphrase, but it's pretty close. He said something to the effect that the chasm between Islam and the infidel is so vast that no bridge can be built to span it, except for the purpose of bringing the infidel to Islam. In other words, the real purpose of this bridge building business, no matter what, our priests and rabbis and so on might say or think or believe, the real purpose for the Brotherhood at least is, again, proselytization, recruitment, conversion, indoctrination, and subversion. Very bad bit of business. And you can go through a couple of these other things. I'm going to talk at the end about this effort to insinuate Sharia into U.S. courts. But time being a little brief, and I do want to leave as much as possible for questions, I wanted to just quickly turn to the last of these items and discuss it in a little bit of detail. Getting Muslim Brotherhood operatives into government or other positions of authority from which they can exercise influence is really important to the brothers. So let me go to the next slide. You're all familiar with this gentleman. I want to just talk in the next slide very briefly about not all of these folks, because in the shortness of time there isn't an opportunity to do justice to it. If you're interested, each of them is profiled in detail in that course that I mentioned, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. I mentioned just, I guess, in passing, the little lady up in the upper left-hand corner. You may know her as Mrs. Anthony Weiner, former member of Congress, former candidate for the mayor of New York, rather disreputable character. His wife is also known as Huma Abedin. She has been very closely linked, both personally and through her family, to the Muslim Brotherhood for decades. And yet she was serving until recently as the Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Department of State under Hillary Clinton. She's still very close to Mrs. Clinton and worked for her before their time at the State Department and will in the future if Hillary goes on to anything else. I want to focus, though, on the man in the middle of the lower tier. If we go to the next slide, I'll introduce you to him. His name is Mohammed Elibiari. He's actually something of a homeboy for you all. He hails from Plano, Texas these days, where he has an organization he calls the Freedom and Justice Foundation. Interestingly, that sounds familiar. Freedom and Justice was the name given to the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Egypt when Mohammed Morsi ran for office and won. There's a lot I could tell you about Elibiari, and I won't get into a great deal of detail, but this is illustrative. He was an apologist for Anwar al-Awlaki, who you may remember was for quite some time an imam here in the Washington, D.C. area, host to several members of the 9/11 hit team, and influential with a bunch of others, notably the shooter at Fort Hood, Nidal Hassan. He was whacked by the United States government running al-Qaeda operations in Yemen last year. Let me go to the next slide, please. Because of Elibiari's ability to reach out to the Muslim community, and despite these rather troubling sympathies, which are matter of public record for bad actors, including al-Awlaki and, for that matter, the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic. He was given a position as an advisor to the Department of Public Safety. I'm happy to report that they subsequently cashiered him. But if you go to the next slide, by virtue of that role in DPS, he managed to get himself onto the advisory committee for the federal Department of Homeland Security. The man standing next to him, by the way, is Bill Bratton, who is now the Commissioner of Police in New York City. Next slide. Just very quickly, I want to give you some insights into how Mohammed Elibiari has conducted himself as an advisor to the Department of Department of Homeland Security. As you see here, shortly after he got a security clearance, because he was on that advisory committee, he began abusing it, next slide, for the purpose, we discovered, of trying to portray your governor as an Islamophobe at a time when he was running for president of the United States. But much more important, next slide, was what Elibiari succeeded in doing, starting on an occasion in September of 2011, when the then director of the FBI decided to give him the Bureau's highest civilian award for his extraordinary contributions to specific cases and his efforts to help with Muslim outreach for the Bureau in the Texas community, the Muslim American community. Next slide. This award was presented at the FBI's Training Academy in Quantico, where there is a Training Academy library. And let me go through these next couple slides very quickly. 6 days after Elie Biari was at the FBI Training Academy in its library, a series of screeds began appearing under the byline and filament in Spencer Ackerman, who's a very radical leftist who writes for Wired magazine, vilifying the FBI's Countering Violent Extremism training program. You might wonder, what is countering violent extremism? Well, that's a euphemism, of course. It's the euphemism that is currently used by the Obama administration in lieu of the previous euphemism used by the Bush administration, which was terrorism. Both are about, actually, jihad. Though the further you get away from describing it, the easier it is to say that the problem really isn't the jihadists, it's I don't know, people who embrace the US Constitution, or are Tea Party activists, or anti-abortion activists, or something else. But the point of this is, if you go to the next slide, please, on the 18th of September, Elie Biari sent a very fawning thank you to a dash note, if you will, to Ackerman at a website called Muslim Matters. Next slide. And on the 23rd of that same month, there was another of these screeds from Ackerman that this time was accompanied by photographs taken on a cell phone in the FBI Training Academy, showing some of the so-called Islamophobic materials that were observed there. Next slide. On the 4th of October, Mohammed Elie Biari and a bunch of his friends, including the American Civil Liberties Union, wrote FBI Director Mueller demanding, on the basis of these various Ackerman articles, that the United States Federal Bureau of Investigations purge its training materials of this kind of offensive material and documentation. On the 19th of that month, next slide please, 57 of these groups, both on the hard left and among the Muslim Brotherhood fronts, including Mohammed Elie Biari's own Freedom and Justice Institute, wrote to John Brennan, who at the time was the Homeland Security Advisor to the President, demanding that not just the FBI's training materials, but all of the other agencies of the government that have that kind of material, that kind of training, that kind of need to know, also be purged. The Defense Department, the intelligence communities, various agencies, the Department of Homeland Security itself, all need to be cleansed of this kind of offensive material to Muslims. Next slide. On November 11th, John Brennan agreed to have all such material removed. He has subsequently been appointed to be the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He is overseeing this kind of information-free training and practice. Next slide, your own Louis Gohmert, one of the most admired members of Congress, as far as I'm concerned, queried the then Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security about what was going on with all of this. What was Elie Biari doing, and why was he being allowed to get away with using classified material to attack the governor of their state? What was he doing getting into this purge of sensitive but necessary information for those who are supposed to protect us? He was assured by Mrs. Napolitano that she would be getting back to him, but as far as I know, she never did. Next slide. I just want to very quickly, and I know I'm probably over time here and taxing your attention, but let me very quickly give you a couple of other examples of what's going on in your own state with respect to problems that reflect the penetration of these jihadists, these civilization jihadists in some cases, in other cases the old-fashioned kind, in the state of Texas itself. Next slide. I think I mentioned that that explanatory memorandum, if I didn't, I should have, was made available to all of us because it was introduced into evidence in the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, which took place not far from New Orleans, Dallas, the Holy Land Foundation trial in 2008. The folks on the upper right are the 5 co-conspirators who were prosecuted and successfully convicted for having provided some $12 million to this terrorist group, Hamas. Next slide. I just want to drill down for a moment on the fellow on the far right, Mufid Abdul Qadir. Mufid Abdul Qadir was described in the trial as one of the most successful of the 5. Next slide. And that is in part because he was a rock star. He would go around the Hamas fundraising circuit singing jihadist songs to audiences and getting them to open their wallets to give money in the form of material support for this designated terrorist organization. You see there an example of the kind of glorifying of suicide bombers that he did in his heyday. Next slide. One other interesting data point about Mufid Abdul Qadir is he is the half-brother of the guy on the right, you may remember is the fellow who runs the designated terrorist organization, Hamas. The other thing, next slide, that should be of particular concern, I think, to all of you there in Texas, is that for 8 years, he was an engineer on the payroll of the city of Dallas. And he was described by the then FBI special agent in charge as a fellow that the mayor at the time of Dallas ought to be concerned about because he had access to detailed technical plans pertaining to the city's infrastructure, unquote. That's not the kind of thing that you would want in the hands of a Hamas sponsor and material supporter. And yet the mayor of the city did nothing about it at the time. Just very quickly, in the next slide, you'll see some 59 mosques. I think this is actually probably out of date. I believe there are more now, just in the Dallas area alone. Again, I hasten to add, not all mosques, any more than all Muslims, are a problem. It's just that many of them are, by an estimate done on the basis of an undercover investigation that a colleague of mine did a couple of years ago of 100 mosques across the United States, looking for evidence that they were promoting Sharia and jihad. He discovered that basically wherever you found them promoting Sharia, they were promoting jihad. And roughly 80 of the 100 mosques that were investigated had evidence of both. Specifically, those that describe themselves as Islamic societies. I don't know if you've got one in Thailand, but you probably do. If you don't, you will in due course. Or maybe an Islamic center of Thailand. Those are Muslim Brotherhood operations. Full stop. Typically, their mortgages are held by something called the North American Islamic Trust, which is one of the groups that was on that list I showed you in the attachment to the explanatory memorandum. This is a Saudi government underwritten Muslim Brotherhood front whose purpose is to buy or initiate mortgages for mosques. And with that kind of ownership, of course, comes a great deal of say over who's the imam for the mosque, what's taught in the madrasas, the schools that are associated with the mosque or the Islamic Center, what's in the bookstores or in the library, in the way of videos or books of various kinds. In other words, it assures that you're able to control the use made of the mosque if you own the mortgage. And when the Saudi government does, through this North American Islamic Trust, you can bet that it's about as bad as it can get. Next slide, please. I mentioned Nidal Hassan earlier, man, of course, charged with workplace violence. Another of those dots that you just got to scratch your head and wonder what's that about. Of course, what he was doing with the influence of Anwar al-Awlaki is jihad, pure and simple. He said as much. When he shouted Allahu Akbar, when he shot 13 of his comrades and a baby in utero, he was about jihad. And in fact, he made it abundantly clear before he engaged in that act that he was going to do it, which makes all the more a travesty that he was not stopped, let alone that he was prosecuted for workplace violence. Next slide. I don't know if these photographs are familiar to you, but in Dallas, not so long ago, I think it was Dallas, maybe it was Houston, not quite sure where, but in Texas in any event, this Egyptian-born fellow, Yasser Said, engaged in the practice also embraced by Sharia of honor killing. He murdered his 2 daughters because they were wearing blue jeans and makeup and dating American boys. This happens in America. This is not the only incident, it just happens to be one that took place in Texas. Next slide. This is a fellow who I mentioned, I think, among other things, Mohammed Ali Biari's involvement with the Brotherhood is evidenced by his attesting, as you see in that last bullet, to this fellow Hassan Hito's high standing with the Muslim Brotherhood at the time that he was being recruited by the Obama administration and installed as the first so-called prime minister of the opposition interim coalition. He didn't last long because you basically have the operation now run by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Islamic State. But it is interesting that this guy hailed from Dallas as a technology executive, but also as a leader of one of the most prominent of the Muslim Brotherhood fronts in the United States, the Council on American-Islamic Relations, or CARE. Okay, I'm nearing the end here. Thank you for your patience. Next slide, if I could, please. This fellow, again, the classic kind of jihadist, the violent kind, tried to blow up a skyscraper in Dallas in 2009. Next slide. This guy, Wissam Alous, was arrested in San Antonio in 2013. He's believed to have been seeking a high government position, or at least a sensitive one, from which he could wage war on behalf of another of these Islamist groups, Hezbollah. Next slide. Lastly, in this series, I just wanted to share with you, you may be aware of this fellow, or at least his charter schools, of which at last count you have, I think, actually over 40. They call themselves Harmony Schools. They operate on the government dime, but they are basically Turkish supremacist versions of the Muslim Brotherhood penetration of the educational system of this country. They're not so brazen as to talk openly about Sharia or about its program, but they sort of mask it in a patina of Turkish, as I say, supremacism. This fellow, Fethullah Gulen, hails from Turkey, though he currently operates a multi-billion-dollar empire of charter schools and other businesses from, as I say, they're an armed camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. This is an operation that bears watching, folks, and if you haven't come across it before now, I would commend that you take a hard look at the Gulen movement, the Gulen schools. There's information about it at our website, securefreedom.org. Again, just to come back to the 6 on this next slide. These are people who have, in fact, executed the civilization jihadist program of gaining positions of sensitive influential access to senior government officials. And I just wanted to tell you, I think this is a very troubling cast of characters, and if you want again to know more about it, check it out at MuslimBrotherhoodAmerica.com. Next slide. And with their influence, and this is probably a busy chart you can't read particularly well, and I apologize for that, but it just gives you some illustrative examples of the kind of impact these people are having in our government today. The policies that are being adopted by the Obama administration that in fact align more and more and more with the dictates or desires of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's worrying to say the least, and what's playing out as we speak in the Gaza Strip is a particularly prime example of this, where you have the U.S. government, not only, as I mentioned earlier, giving 47 million of your tax dollars to this designated terrorist organization, Hamas, and the guise of humanitarian aid. You have the U.S. government shutting down the only international airport of any consequence in Israel, with huge impact on tourism and on commerce and on the lives of Israeli citizens, emboldening Hamas, needless to say. And not least, you have John Kerry there, as we speak, trying to broker a ceasefire to protect Hamas from the destruction that I pray personally the Israelis will mete out. So this is an ongoing problem. It's not past history, and it's happening, I believe, in part because of the successful penetration of the U.S. government by these Muslim Brotherhood folks. This was of sufficient concern, next slide, back in the summer of 2000.